Hello everyone, Just Podcast TV is here. Please don't forget to like and subscribe and hit the bell icon to get notified on new contents.
Episode 170. No one gets in Elliot's way. Elliot smiled and patted James's shoulder again. "What are you doing here?" James laughed and replied, "I wanted to ask you the same question." "Oh, that's a long story." At this moment, a girl who was standing next to Elliot suddenly said with an anxious expression, "Uncle Elliot, I'm afraid I won't be able to catch up." She seemed to be in a hurry. James looked at the girl who was tall and slim, with long legs. Although her looks were not as delicate as Vanessa's or Krista's, her facial features were sharply defined. She seemed to have a cold and elegant temperament. From her facial features alone, she could not be considered a great beauty, but when her looks were combined with her overall temperament, she was definitely a cold and elegant queen. Before Elliot could answer the tall girl, James asked him, "What's going on? You were having some kind of quarrel just now. What's the matter?" If someone was giving his friend Elliot a hard time, he was going to make it his business. Elliot was greeting Krista and Vanessa, who had just come up. When he heard James's question, he instantly became furious. "I'll tell you what happened," he said. "This is Edie Callahan. She is the daughter of a friend of mine, and she recently won a modeling competition back home. She's a special guest of Paris Fashion Week. The organizer said that she fits their style. But my friend couldn't accompany his daughter here, so since he knows that I'm working in Paris, he asked me to be her escort. Edie's smart, but she's still pretty young, and she's never traveled on her own before. Her father has even called me a few times to remind me to take good care of his daughter. Of course, I assured him that there is no problem. Leave this matter to me, I said. But Edie's flight was delayed and arrived several hours late. I rushed her here in a hurry, but the event has already started. The French are incredibly punctual. They can't stand lateness, so we were directly blocked by the security guards outside the door. No matter how we explain it to them, they will not listen. Apparently, their boss told them that no one is allowed to enter after the show has started." Elliot Klein told James the whole story in one breath. What idiots, thought James. They don't know that they're dealing with one of the biggest names in New York City. They are really blind. Good thing I came along. Then he said to his friend, "I got it, Elliot. Leave it to me." Elliot was stunned when he heard that. His eyes were full of doubt. Edie had a questioning look in her eyes too. Even Vanessa, Krista, and Katie looked hesitant. After all, if Mr. Klein couldn't resolve this matter, how could James? "What? You don't believe me?" asked James, frowning. "Let's just say I'm skeptical," said Elliot. But although James was wearing casual clothes, Elliot knew how much influence he'd had back in New York. God only knew what this mysterious kid could pull off, so Elliot didn't dare to underestimate him. After all, weren't they like brothers? James walked over and stood in front of one of the security guards. He coughed twice and then said loudly to him, "Do you know who you're blocking?" The security guard stared straight ahead, ignoring him. "You are refusing admission to a famous business magnate of New York, Mr. Klein, Elliot Klein. Do you know that?" Seeing James saying these useless things, everyone was embarrassed. "Just let it go. My name isn't famous here," said Elliot. If his name alone had been useful, he and Edie would have gone in a long time ago. James said, "Of course I know that. I'm just warming him up." Then he continued to the security guard, who was still ignoring him. "Do you know who I am? My name is James Tucker, and Mr. Klein is like a brother to me." Elliot was too embarrassed to continue looking. This was pointless. James was just making a scene. Edie looked at James as if she were looking at an idiot. At first she had hoped that he really could help her. Now it all seemed like a big joke. Even the security guard who was standing there motionless could not help but laugh. However, Krista had faith in him. She whispered to Elliot, "Mr. Klein, don't worry. Mr. Tucker knows what he's doing." When Elliot heard that, he raised his eyebrows. His curiosity was aroused. Krista had been his steadiest employee. What had this friend of his, whom he had not seen for almost a year, done to win such confidence from such an intelligent woman? James changed his tone and finally said his most important words. "But apart from that, I am also the owner of the Verrery Garden." James's face darkened. He shouted at the security guard, I demand that you let us in immediately." Everyone was stunned by James's shout. Elliot looked at him and asked awkwardly, "Bro, are you all right?" Elliot knew that James was a powerful man back home, but this was a different country. If he said that the Verrery garden was his, it was obvious that he was talking nonsense. As for Edie, she turned away from him. She had never been so embarrassed in her life. James was going to make them look like a bunch of dumb Americans in front of all of these people. Although the security guard still didn't say anything, he looked at James as if he were crazy. After all, the Verrery garden was one of Paris's landmarks. Since when was it the private property of some foreigner? At this moment, Edie looked at Elliot and said helplessly, "Uncle Elliot, why don't we go? Let's just forget this whole thing." She would rather be anywhere else. She didn't want to be associated with James. But before Elliot could say anything, James slapped his chest and said, "Don't be anxious, kid. You have to stand up for your rights, and I have the final say here. I can kick all these people out if I want to." He meant what he said. The Verrery garden was his. Naturally, he had the right to kick everyone out. But Edie looked at James as if she were looking at an idiot. The disdain in her eyes couldn't be described with words. Even Vanessa couldn't bear to watch this scene. "Don't look at him like that," she said to Edie. "Mr. Tucker is trying to help you, and you act like he's something you scraped off your shoe. Didn't your parents teach you any manners?" James was like family to her. Maybe the others could sit by and watch him be abused, but not Vanessa. In her eyes, he was a legend. He did everything right. She wouldn't let anyone look down on him. Although Edie was young, she had a fiery temper. She demanded, "Who doesn't have manners? Who are you talking about?" "I'm talking about you." Elliot and Krista quickly moved to stop them from going any further. The situation was already painful enough. Katie didn't get involved, but her expression showed support for Vanessa. Like Vanessa, she felt that whatever James said was right. In her eyes, he could do no wrong. "I was wondering why he didn't say anything," James said. "It just turns out that he is just a statue." He nudged the security guard he'd been talking to as well as the one next to him. Who was James? He was a skillful fighter, and the strength in his hands was incredible. With just a little push, the two security guards were sent flying like two human sandbags. They crashed to the ground in the distance, producing two dull and solid thuds. "Don't!" Elliot was just about to stop James, but the two burly security guards had already been sent flying. "Oh no," said Elliot, who felt that this matter was getting worse and worse. Krista was also stunned on the spot. She hadn't expected this. Edie, on the other hand, still seemed to think it was all a joke. She looked at James with a completely indifferent attitude, as if it had nothing to do with her. Vanessa was so angry that she stomped her feet, not wanting James to help this arrogant woman. However, James's thoughts were completely different from theirs. He was thinking that there was nothing to talk about with these security guards. He just wanted to cause a commotion and get the person in charge out here. Then this matter would be easy to resolve. The two sturdy security guards were in agony from the fall. They immediately got up and furiously roared as they pounced at James. Predictably, James easily pushed the two of them and sent them flying again. This time they called for backup on their walkie-talkies. "Come on, James, why don't we just go?" Elliot had already started to retreat. He didn't want things to get any worse. "Go? Go where?" said James calmly. "This place is mine. These security guards are all working for me. Why should we leave? I want you all to be my guests here to enjoy the feeling of the Imperial Garden. I want you to experience the extravagance and nobility of the palace too." His words were neither fast nor slow. It sounded like he was talking big, but he said it all matter-of-factly. Elliot Klein was one of the most powerful people in New York City. Now that he saw James had such courage, he didn't say anything else. He nodded slightly and said, "All right, James. Even if the sky collapses today, I will fight along with you." 20 to 30 strong security guards were rushing over from all directions. In an instant, they had surrounded James and Elliot and their companions. Even if they wanted to leave now, there was no chance. However, when James saw this situation, not only did he not panic, he even grinned and said, "Well, Elliot, this is a very interesting situation we find ourselves in. 171. The Brawl. Elliot was amazed to see James still grinning at a moment like this. Being surrounded by so many strong security guards, even Elliot Klein, who had seen a lot in his life, felt his knees go weak. However, James looked like he was on a luxury cruise. Who was he? He had escaped death in the pirate's den, fought the Black Bear alone on the deserted island, and wiped out a group of pirates single-handedly. He had beaten the #1 assassin in the criminal underworld and then made the man submit to him. Could such a person be afraid of these few security personnel? Of course not. Vanessa, Katie, and Krista had already seen James's abilities, so they weren't surprised. Instead, they looked with sympathy at the burly security guards around them. As for Edie, the daughter of Elliot's friend, she was naturally standing behind Elliot at this moment. She was scared to death. Uncle Elliot, I told you we should leave just now, but you didn't listen. Now we can't. She was flustered and exasperated. At this moment, she looked at the ferocious security guards around her and actually blamed Elliot. However, since things had come to this, he could only blame himself secretly. He had not listened to her opinion just now, and his face was full of regret. One of the 2 security guards James had pushed away suddenly pointed at him and shouted, "Hey, it was this guy who caused the trouble just now. Everyone, let's teach him a lesson." When everyone heard this, they instantly raised their sandbag-like fists and swung them at James. "James, let me help you block them." Elliot was scared, but he wasn't about to abandon this person who was like a brother to him. He defeated the fear in his heart and rushed over to help James. James was very touched, but he naturally wouldn't let Elliot take the risk. With just a twist of his right hand, Elliot was instantly pulled behind him. James quickly said to Elliot, "These people are no match for me. Listen to me. Get the girls out of here." However, his hands did not stop moving. He threw a punch at one security guard who was rushing over. The 2 fists collided violently in the air, producing a solid but muffled sound. The sturdy security guard was sent flying on impact. James knocked away the other 2 security guards who were rushing over. They fell to the ground so badly injured that they could not get up. The first security guard who had rushed at James grabbed his fist with his other hand and rolled on the ground wailing. His entire wrist had been shattered. Although the other 2 guards had not confronted James head-on, they were also lying on the ground in extreme pain. They couldn't believe this small man had defeated them so easily. The other security guards immediately retreated, their eyes filled with fear. Elliot and Edie were standing at James with their mouths agape. Their eyes were as wide as if they were looking at a monster. How could he possess such strength? This didn't make any sense at all. Seeing that the other security guards were temporarily stunned, James took this opportunity to turn around and say to Elliot, "What are you waiting for? The girls." Elliot's mouth was wide open, and he was still in a daze. After being reminded by James, he finally realized what was going on. He immediately nodded and said, "Oh, yes." In fact, Vanessa, Krista, and Katie were already used to this kind of scene. They had already walked farther away. They didn't want blood to splatter their clothing. "Edie, let's go." Elliot did not hesitate anymore. He knew that not only would he not be able to help James, but he would even cause trouble for him if he got involved. He took his charge, who was still stunned, by the wrist and walked with her towards Vanessa and the others. "What?" she said. "Where are we going?" Before Elliot could reply, Vanessa said from afar, "Do you want to get caught in the middle of this? It's a good thing you're pretty. You're not very smart." She looked at Elliot with disdain. Vanessa could not stand this stuck-up girl who had no respect for James. Edie was so angry that she stomped her feet as she walked over to the other women. What about me? I wish I had known about that modeling competition you won. I would have entered, and then maybe the winner would have had some brains." Vanessa had a hot temper, and once she got going, no one could stop her sharp mouth. Uncle Elliot, look at her." Edie was still a girl. She didn't know how to respond. Katie, who disliked her, immediately felt happy when she saw this. She clapped her hands and cheered. Elliot was very embarrassed. After all, Vanessa didn't even know him or Edie. why was she giving Edie such a hard time? Moreover, he knew Vanessa's father, David Harrison. He couldn't just tell her off, so he could only look at Krista as if he were asking for help. Krista understood, and she lightly touched Vanessa's arm. "Hey, that's enough." Only then did Vanessa let out a cold snort and let it go. Seeing this, Elliot quickly changed the subject. "Well, let's see how James is doing." It was obvious that the most important problem now was not their internal conflict, but the external one. More than a dozen security guards surrounded James. Although they were a bit afraid, they still felt that they had the advantage in numbers. They were waiting for an opportunity to attack. Some of them even had tasers. However, James did not seem to feel any pressure at all. He even smiled and waved at the security guards. "All right, come on, don't waste my time. Are we going to do this or what?" Provoked, the guards finally couldn't help but attack. One by one, they waved their tasers and charged forward. The live electricity sizzled in their weapons. Unfortunately, they were too slow in James's eyes. There was the muffled sound of a fist hitting the ground along with the sizzling sound of electric current from the tasers. Then the security personnel were lying on the ground in disorder. They had either been sent flying by James's fist or knocked unconscious by their own weapons. In short, they had all lost the ability to resist. There was only one security guard left standing. He looked at James with fear as if he were looking at a devil. In the end, he gritted his teeth and rushed towards James. James's fist was like the wind as it rushed towards the man's face. The fellow was so frightened that he lost his composure. He couldn't help but let out a scream. He even closed his eyes, waiting for the blow to send him flying. However, James's fist stopped 3 inches from his left cheek. But when the guard opened his eyes, he was so scared that he fell to the ground. James retracted his fist. He said casually, "Get in there and bring out someone who can talk." The burly security guard immediately nodded. He crawled through the entrance of the Verrery garden. Episode 172, A Single Sentence. Elliot felt his mouth go dry as he looked at the guards moaning on the ground, and at James standing there with his hands behind his back, looking relaxed. He counted, and including that last security guard who had run inside, there was a total of 28. They were very strong and well-trained, but they were as fragile as paper soldiers in front of James. They could not withstand a single blow from his fists. They hadn't even touched James before they were sent flying. Elliot was dazzled by the sight. Before he had been able to understand what James was doing, those men were lying on the ground in disorder. Elliot couldn't help but walk over and express his admiration. "James, you were awesome." James laughed. His face was not red and his heart was not beating faster than usual. He did not even look like he had just been in a fight. It was as if nothing had happened. "Your skill is amazing. Where did you learn to fight like that?" asked Elliot. "Oh, that? Just a few little tricks of mine." James naturally avoided talking about this topic. He did not want his secrets to be discovered by others. His friend's eyes widened. Although he didn't say anything, his expression clearly meant, "What? You call this a few little tricks? You wipe the floor with these guys." However, Elliot could take a hint. He knew that James didn't want to go into it, so he didn't ask any more questions. At this moment, Edie, who before had been looking at James with contempt, also came over and looked at him with admiration. To be honest, it was only now that she realized James was actually a handsome man. She had been in too much of a hurry before to notice it, but he was handsome, as well as strong. The guard who had run in to deliver the news brought out a few men in suits. He whispered something to one of them. The man nodded. He was calm. Although James could see the surprise in his heart with just a glance, he was keeping it hidden. The man walked over and said to James, "Hello, sir. I am Herrick, head of security for Paris Fashion Week. What is the meaning of all of this?" He frowned and pointed at the security guards lying on the ground. James raised his eyebrows and smiled, saying, "Well, I have the final say in what goes on around here. I'm sorry, but I don't think you can handle this. Go in and call your boss." He was telling the truth. He wanted to talk to someone who could make decisions regarding Edie. He didn't know that Herrick, who looked like an ordinary man, had a very extraordinary life history. He was not a proper soldier, but he had once worked as a mercenary. His fighting skills were comparable to those of a special forces soldier, but he had fallen in love with a Parisian and made this city his home. He had made a lot of money in his former life. He didn't need to work, but because his lover was working on Paris Fashion Week, he had gotten involved too. He wanted to be close to her and keep her safe. He was utterly devoted to her. Now the security department he was in charge of had been wiped out. He had to fight back. Herrick chuckled when he heard James's words. Then he took off his suit jacket and assumed a fighting stance. He's actually a fighter, said James. Interesting. Without saying a word, Herrick threw a punch at James. It was so fast that even an ordinary person could see that he was much stronger than the other security guards. Unfortunately, although Herrick had such experience, in James's eyes, he was much weaker than the famous #1 assassin in the underground world, Dax Freeman. James merely turned his body sideways and easily dodged the straight punch. Herrick retracted his fist. He lowered his body and swept his leg across the ground at an extremely high speed. In fact, this guy was very cunning. His punch just now had been a distraction, and the sweeping kick was the real ace up his sleeve. James was impressed, seeing that this man knew how to combine reality and illusion. An ordinary person would have gone down by now. Unfortunately for Herrick, James was not an ordinary person. James only took a sideways step back and easily dodged his attack. Currently, his 5 senses were extremely sensitive. His opponent's every move was under James's scrutiny. When he saw that his ferocious attacks were unable to harm James at all, or even touch him, Herrick saw red. He turned around and kicked at James with a high whip kick. Then he rolled on the ground and pulled a sharp paratrooper knife from his waist with his right hand. Herrick waved his arms, and a bunch of dazzling blade flowers flew from his hands. Those flowers attacked James from 3 different directions. They wrapped around James's entire body. No one saw how he managed to break through the attack. With a dull bang, Herrick was sent flying. The blade flowers disappeared in an instant, but James still stood there with a calm expression on his face. Herrick's skill wasn't too bad. He forcefully turned his body in the air and landed firmly on the ground in the distance. In the blink of an eye, he raised his hand and threw out his paratrooper blade. With tremendous force, the blade moved like an arrow and shot towards James's forehead. Seeing this, Edie couldn't help but scream. In the next second, everyone was stunned, because James just stood there without moving. However, the paratrooper knife was not protruding from his forehead. Instead, he was holding it tightly between his teeth. The handle was still trembling violently from the force of the throw. What? Oh my God! Everyone's eyes were filled with astonishment when they saw this. Even Herrick was filled with indescribable shock. How did you do it? He stammered. He no longer had the courage to continue fighting. James had a calm expression on his face. He spat out the blade and weighed it in his hand. This is a good blade. James stabbed it into the ground in front of Herrick. The onlookers couldn't help but exclaim again. The knife had gone through the ground like it was butter. James took no notice. He said to Herrick, "You've heard of Dax Freeman, right? Even he fears me. So now you know what you should do." "What did you say?" Herrick was panicking. At this moment, he could not even breathe properly. He had worked as a mercenary all over the world. How could he not have known about the infamous Dax Freeman? Today he had encountered a monster that even that legendary assassin feared. "All right, wait a moment, sir. I know what to do." After he finished speaking, Herrick hurriedly grabbed at the blade in the ground, preparing to go in and inform those in charge of the show about James. However, he used all his strength, and his face turned red, but he could not pull the knife out of the ground. He was so embarrassed that he wanted to die. Seeing this, James used only 2 fingers to gently pick up the paratrooper knife and handed it to Herrick. "Go quickly," he said. "My time is very limited." Herrick bowed politely to James, then turned around and ran inside the garden. After seeing James's power, everyone was petrified. With just one sentence, he'd put Herrick in his place. Episode 173. He really does have some strength. Back in New York, Elliot had just thought of James as a clever man. Now in his eyes, James was like a god. Very soon, Herrick returned, leading a man in his 50s who had white hair and was dressed very fashionably. "Hello," the older man said respectfully. "I'm Simon Boulanger, the director of Paris Fashion Week. You must be James Tucker." Obviously, Herrick had told him everything that had happened. That was why he was so polite. "I am," said James. "What do you need us to do, Mr. Tucker?" asked Boulanger. In fact, he was terrified by what Herrick had told him. Although Herrick had retired to Paris for the sake of his lover, there were a few people who knew about his past. Although Simon Boulanger did not know about Dax Freeman, anyone who could intimidate Herrick was no pushover. When James heard this, he immediately pointed at Edie, who was standing in front of Elliot, and said, "Niece, come over here." Edie was shocked to hear such a young man calling her his niece, but she still walked over obediently. James said to Boulanger, "This is my niece, the winner of the Empire State Model Competition. She has been invited to attend Paris Fashion Week, but her plane was delayed. By the time we got here, we were an hour late. But no matter what we told the security guards, they refused to listen, which led to this unpleasantness. Would you please take care of this situation, Mr. Boulanger?" When Boulanger saw Edie with her slender figure, long legs, and coldly elegant features, he immediately exclaimed, "She is a natural model. She should have been let in right away. Mr. Tucker, don't worry. Leave everything to me. There is no problem at all. If this young lady does not participate in Paris Fashion Week, it will be a great loss to us. Everyone, there is no time to lose. Please, Paris Fashion Week is currently in progress. We need to hurry up." After Simon Boulanger finished speaking, he immediately extended his hand and ushered everyone inside. James did not care whether Boulanger was speaking hypocritically or sincerely. He shook hands with him, then he turned around and motioned to Elliot. "Elliot, please follow me." Elliot and Edie were both shocked when they saw that James had achieved his goal through such unconventional means. They walked with him through the gates of the Verrerie Garden. Elliot felt like he was in a dream. Looking at his friend's leisurely pace, Elliot felt unworthy of being called James's friend. However, Vanessa, Katie, and Krista were much calmer. They had expected such an outcome. No matter what happened, as long as James was around, they knew there would be no trouble. Looking at the man walking slowly in front of them, the three women felt at ease. The interior of the garden was indeed very lively. This was the world's biggest fashion festival. All sorts of world-renowned clothing brands were represented here, and the place was full of models of all different skin tones. They were wearing exaggerated clothing and parading on the runway, displaying the latest designs to the audience. And this was no ordinary audience. It was made up of Hollywood royalty and important figures in society from all over the world. There were also many giants in the fashion industry who were constantly looking for business opportunities. Because Paris Fashion Week was not only a show, but also an important business affair, the fashion styles and trends debuted here would reverberate throughout the world. Simon Boulanger led James's group directly toward the runway. When they got close, James saw many familiar figures. There were famous musicians and film stars there, and several NBA players. James wanted to rush over and take a photo with the athletes, but then he thought about it. He was now a person with status. He was different from the person who was so poor that he did not even dare to imagine going abroad. He couldn't let the sight of some famous people make him lose his mind. Simon directly brought James and his group to the best viewing spot at the front of the runway and invited them to sit down. He smiled and brought Edie to the backstage area in a hurry. Obviously, he wanted to arrange for her to go on stage as soon as possible. Those seated around James and the others looked over at them curiously. Who were these strange newcomers? Elliot and the three beauties were dressed up. However, James's casual sportswear made him look out of place. The onlookers thought it was kind of disrespectful. Didn't he know he was at an important event? But it wasn't that James did not respect the venue, he just didn't feel comfortable in a suit and dress shoes. He didn't like knowing strangers were judging him, but he dismissed it from his mind. Even if they were discussing and mocking him, what did it matter? After all, he knew something they didn't. He thought to himself, if I want, I can throw them out at any time and stop this world-class grand event. Thinking of this, James felt a sense of satisfaction. It was as if he were riding a rocket. At this moment, the surrounding audience suddenly burst out in shock. Wow, she's so beautiful. James could not help but look up. He saw a tall, cool model on the platform. It was none other than Edie Callahan. James chuckled when he saw what a sensation she was causing. It looks like Boulanger wasn't just flattering me. This girl has really got it.